Hi, I'm Eric Francis, and I'm here today to discuss how to ask good questions and cultivate inquiry in distance teaching and home learning. Now, before I go into what a good question does, or I go into explaining how to develop and deliver those inquiry-based learning experiences, I want to ask you a question. How do children learn? More specifically, how do children between the ages of 2 and 5 before they enroll in school learn? They ask questions. In fact, research shows that a child will ask up to 288 questions a day, all to their mother. Why? Because that's the adult, that's the individual whom they trust to give them the information so they can learn, so they can understand. And that's why children ask so many questions. Have you ever been with a child between the age of 2 and 5? What are the questions they always ask? Either how or why. And these questions they ask, it's not like you can give the response off the top of your head. You actually have to maybe go and Google the question your child asked so you can get them an answer. And see, that's how children learn before they go to school, or how they learn outside of school. They ask questions. Now, when they go to school, that changes. The questioning for learning shifts. Now it's the teacher who's asking the questions, and the questions are being asked not for learning, but to assess learning. So now students are not asking questions, now they're answering questions. And it creates an anxiety because students know that when they're asked that question, they better be correct, or there's going to be consequences. They're not going to be proficient. If they can't answer that item, which probably is not phrased as a question on a test. More often than not, items on a test, they say, do this, here's the problem, or here's the sample, and you got two ways you can answer it, correctly or incorrectly. You got a 50-50 chance. Or if they're asked a question, it's a multiple choice question, and you're using higher level thinking to try to figure out which is the correct answer from the 3 distractors that you've been given. That's questioning in school. That's the way questioning has been. Well, school's changed now, hasn't it? What's interesting, actually, is that there's no tests now. All the tests have been excused. All the federal requirements for testing has been put on hold. So how are our students going to learn? And how do we know if they're learning? Well, we're going to have to shift the way we use our questions. Because when you ask a good question, and it's not really what a good question is. Any question can be a good question. It's what a good question does and what you do with a question. And the way to know if your good question is doing what it's supposed to when it comes to learning, ask yourself this. Does it stimulate deeper thinking? Does it deepen knowledge, understanding, awareness? Does your question expand knowledge and extend thinking? Does it pique curiosity, imagination, interest, and wonder? And does it allow students to express and share not only their knowledge and thinking, but also their disposition, their attitudes, their beliefs, and their values in their own unique way? If your question does that, then you asked a good question. Now, to create that culture of inquiry, you need to use those good questions to basically get the kids not to answer, but to address and respond. That's how they will develop and demonstrate their learning. Some of the questions, you only have to answer correctly. Most of the questions, you have to either establish and explain with examples, examine and explain with evidence, or explore and explain with examples and evidence over an extended period. I've come up with actually an inquiry process, and it's not a step-by-step process. Actually, it's more fluid. It talks about the experience of inquiry, because that's what inquiry is. There's a lot of people who talk about questioning and inquiry, and they give the impression it's the same thing. It's not. Inquiry is the experience. Inquiry is the process. Inquiry is the feeling. Questioning is the resource and tool that gets you into the experience or to go through the process or have the feelings of inquiry. So you use good questions, which again, stimulate deeper thinking, deepen knowledge, understanding, awareness, expand knowledge, extend thinking, pique curiosity, imagination, interest, and wonder, and encourage students to express and share their learning and their feelings in their own unique way. You use that to create that culture of inquiry. And the culture of inquiry I came up with, I call it Inquiring Minds. I named it after the old National Enquirer ad. Inquiring minds want to know. You're right. And with children, inquiring minds want to learn. That's why a child between the age of 2 and 5 asks so many questions. Inquiring minds want to know, want to learn. So in this inquiry-based learning experience, there's 5 different experiences. The first experience, that's what starts it. That's what initiates it. That's the thing actually that is the most structured or the most focused part of this inquiry-based learning experience. Your first question has to hook them. You got to hook the kids' curiosity and interest to learn. And that question can be profound. It can be that big question. We can ask the kids, what is life? And we just leave it out there. And then we encourage the kids to think about it by asking them, what's the dictionary definition of life? What is the religious definition of life? What's the social definition of life? What is the political definition of life or legal definition of life? Or how has the definition of life changed over time? That's how I'm hooking them. Why? Because I'm teaching a science lesson about how science explains natural events and phenomena such as life. And that science unit is on organisms and how they grow and develop in an environment. So my question is, how does an organism grow and develop in an environment? And that becomes what we call our topical essential question. That's what gets the kids learning. That's what gets the kids thinking, hook them. It could also be a simple question. You could ask the kids, who's the first president of the United States? Most likely they'll say George Washington. And then you say, how do you know? Now you got them thinking. Now you pique their curiosity and their interest. And you can even have them go and Google the question. See, a lot of people say Google. If you can Google the question, it's not a good question. It's not true. Google's our resource. Google is basically where we go and acquire our information. It does basically help us answer, or more specifically, address and respond to good questions. And when they Google that question, who's the first president of the United States, they find there's a guy named John Hanson. And John Hanson was the person who was the first president appointed as a president of the United States in Congress assembled on the Articles of Confederation. So the real question here, which is the question historians are actually debating, is should George Washington still be credited as the first president of the United States, or should we also acknowledge the other 8 presidents who were appointed in the Articles of Confederation before the ratification of the Constitution and Washington was elected? That's how I hook my students. I can even hook them with saying, what is 2 plus 2? And if they tell me 4, I say, what do you mean? Because the question then leads into this: how can addition be used to find the sum of 2 numbers, such as 2 plus 2? That's how I hook them. Now, the other 4 levels of questioning is basically this. You have foundational inquiry. That's where students build and develop their foundational knowledge and functional understanding. The way I do it is I present my students with a segment of text, and I present my student with the standard, and I say to them, what are the words, terms, and details you don't know and understand yet? How would you phrase that to me as a question? And they come up with questions, asking questions about what it is they're reading, what are the words, what are the terms, what are the details they don't know and understand, and they create the foundational learning experience. The next level is understanding. And understanding comes straight from the standards. See, standards are not questions. Sometimes people like to say they are questions because they're on an assessment. They're actually directives. They actually tell you do this. If you read a standard, you're going to sound like R. Lee Emery. Fluently multiply multi-digit numbers using the standard algorithm. Sir, we need to change that objective. We need to change that directive into a question. And I can change it to this. How can the standard algorithm be used to multiply multi-digit numbers? Still the standard. In fact, it's actually a more authentic evaluation of student learning than the 25 items I could give them, because they have to demonstrate and communicate how can the standard algorithm be used to multiply multi-digit numbers. Or I could ask, how could multi-digit numbers be multiplied using the standard algorithm? Now I'm hypothetical, but I'm still addressing the standard. And that's the level of inquiry of understanding. It's standards-based. Turn your standards into a question. That's what we're going to have to do in this learning environment that we're currently experiencing. We're going to have to turn our standards into questions, and we can assess it not based upon how many items they can answer correctly or incorrectly, but how deeply and how clearly can they demonstrate and communicate their learning. The next level is depth. And depth is when you go beyond the standard. This is where you're starting to investigate what are the causes, what are the consequences, what are the connections, the reasons, the relationship to results. This is where you're starting to think hypothetically. You ask the most creative question we can ask children. Ask anybody, actually. What if? Ask anybody what if. Watch this. What if we find a cure for the pandemic before school starts in the fall? What if we don't? What if we never find a cure? What if we have to completely change the way we provide education within the next year, within the next 5 years, within the next 10 years, forever? See, you're thinking creatively now because you're using your imagination. You're thinking about it. That's the depth. That's the deep question. That's the third level of inquiring minds. The fourth is expertise. And with teaching and learning for expertise using inquiry and good questions, it's as simple as taking your standard and putting 3 words in front of it. How could you? Watch. Fluently multiply multi-digit numbers using the standard algorithm. How could you multiply multi-digit numbers using the standard algorithm? If you do that with every standard, not only are you making a personalized question that basically focuses on how students synthesize their learning, it's the most authentic question we can ask. And that's what we're going to have to do to go and shift our teaching and learning in this time. We're still going to ask questions. And students are still going to have to not answer, but address and respond to them. But we're not going to use them solely for the purpose of assessment. We're going to ask the questions for instruction. So here's my questions to you to end this. Number 1, how can we recapture that joy of learning students experience, that children experience before they go to school by learning from asking questions? Number 2, how could you take every bit of instruction that you do, every directive you want to give the kid, every time you want to go and post that objective, how could you rephrase that and restate it as a question? Number 3, how can I help you? And that's what I'm here to do. This is not something we're going to have to do by ourselves. We're in this together. We're all trying to figure out what teaching and learning is going to be like in the future. In fact, I have to be honest with you. Some people say to me, so how's teaching and learning going to change? I don't know. And that's the most exciting thing about it. I don't know what the future brings with teaching and learning. All I can do is think critically, and all I can do is think creatively about what could it be? What could education become as a result of what's going on right now with this pandemic? What could you do to make education better? That's what we need to be asking, not only ourselves, but also our students. Good questions. And I look forward to helping you, to working with you, and to going on this journey and creating an entirely new education reform that can really, really transform teaching and learning for everybody. Thank you, and stay healthy and safe.